Welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5340, Introduction to Public Policy and Management. This is part 2 of the readings from Section 11 on Cultural Competence, Reparations, and Public Policy. We're about to embark on a really crucial, complex, and sometimes, uncomfortable deep dive today. We're bridging American history, economic policy, and, the ongoing quest for justice. Today, we're moving past those initial debates to focus squarely on the systemic post-slavery injustices, the ones that really created persistent economic inequality. And we'll look at some, frankly, startling economic calculations proposed to address that debt.
It is definitely a complex topic, and to help you navigate these arguments, the philosophical, the economic, the historical, we've synthesized 3 major sources. They each approach the issue from, pretty distinct academic lenses. First up, we've got the philosophical and policy framework from Housing Discrimination as a Basis for Black Reparations. That's by Jonathan Kaplan and Andrew Valls from Public Affairs Quarterly in 2007. They really provide the theory for shifting the focus away from, the Civil War era itself.
Right. And then there's the really dense quantitative economic analysis. That's Thomas Kramer's 2015 study, Estimating Slavery Reparations, Present Value Comparisons of Historical Multi-Generational Reparations Policies. He's focused much more on calculating the sheer magnitude of the debt tied to the unremunerated slave labor itself.
Exactly. And finally, kind of anchoring our discussion in narrative and moral context, we have Ta-Nehisi Coates' seminal 2014 article in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations. So our mission today really is to understand precisely how these injustices rooted not just way back in the 19th century, but crucially deeply entrenched in the mid-20th century through explicit government policy created the structural conditions for today's racial wealth gap. We want to understand the mechanisms proposed to first quantify and then, potentially address that outstanding debt.
Okay, let's unpack this right away, because Kaplan and Valls, they start with a strategic, almost revolutionary philosophical shift, you could say. They argue that focusing only on the original institution of slavery, abolished back in 1865, is actually a strategic mistake in the modern push for reparations. The core idea here is, while the inequality is rooted in slavery, it persists because the country failed to take effective steps after slavery to dismantle the hierarchy that was already there.
Yeah, and this is such a critical distinction for, any policy student to grasp. Focusing just on the distant past leads you straight into these philosophical roadblocks. People like Jeremy Waldron talk about this idea of superseding historic injustice. The argument being essentially that the passage of time can, erode or even dissolve compensation claims, especially when all these other things happen in between that kind of muddy the waters.
And it's not just a legal thing, right? There's also this knowledge problem. Glenn Lowry called it the epistemological fog.
Exactly. And what's fascinating about that idea, the fog, it represents the sheer impossibility, really, of knowing what we'd need to know to justly distribute compensation for things that happened 150 years ago. How could you possibly calculate the precise counterfactual? What would life for descendants of slaves look like today if slavery had never happened? What jobs would people have chosen? What land might they have bought? I mean, these are variables we can't access or model in any fair way.
And beyond the philosophical headache, there's a political vulnerability, too. When the whole argument rests on an injustice that's over a century and a half old, it makes it easier for opponents to just dismiss it. Ancient history, why should I pay, all that.
Precisely. And that's exactly why the strategic move that Kaplan and Valls and others like Boris Bitker before them suggest is to shift the focus. Focus on the more recent, distinct, systemic wrongs committed during the Jim Crow era. Roughly from the end of Reconstruction, 1877, up until the Civil Rights Movement really got going in the 50s and 60s, these wrongs, segregated schools, being denied access to economic programs, job discrimination, second-class citizenship, these were explicit state and federal policies, often within living memory.
And the beauty of that shift, thinking about policy, is that it kind of cuts through that fog, right? These are injuries that happen to identifiable people who are alive or maybe their parents. It reframes the whole demand. It's not about compensating for the condition of slavery itself, but compensating for the state's failure to grant full citizenship and economic rights after slavery supposedly ended.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Of all those different wrongs during Jim Crow, employment, education, voting, Kaplan and Valls choose to zero in specifically on housing and lending discrimination, particularly in the post-World War II era. So Why single out housing? Why make that the basis for reparations?
Well, they list two huge advantages. First, it's recent and ongoing. Housing discrimination didn't just stop, it continues today. So that provides a really clear legal and political link to the inequality we see right now. It's not purely historical.
And second, and this is absolutely crucial for you as a policy student, it is quantifiable. Unlike, say, trying to put a dollar value on lost political rights, denying access to homeownership has these really clear, measurable economic consequences. You can track it through housing values, homeownership rates, differences in access to capital. Focusing on housing shines a spotlight directly on that black-white wealth gap, which is, arguably the most potent driver of persistent racial inequality today.
Okay, so before we get into the policy mechanics, we really need to grasp the scale of this wealth gap that housing helped create. Kaplan and Dahl cite data from the early 2000s. It showed the median net worth of white American families was around $121,000. For African American families, just $19,000.
Yeah, just think about that for a second. Black families, on average, were earning about 60% of white income, but held only 16% as much wealth. It's a massive disparity.
That statistic is, well, it's chilling. But the key question is why? Why is the gap so much bigger than the income gap? And the answer really lies in the nature of home equity. Homeownership is kind of unique, right? It lets families build wealth through leverage. You put down a relatively small amount, and you get access to this massive asset. Its value grows, hopefully, through capital gains.
Yeah.
You can tap into that asset, leverage it to pay for college, start a business, or just have a cushion when things get tough. This whole mechanism, especially passing that equity down through generations, was systematically denied to Black Americans.
And the history of that denial, it's tied directly to government policy right after World War II. The Federal Housing Authority, the FHA, it absolutely revolutionized the American economy starting back in 1934. See, before the FHA, mortgages were usually really short-term, maybe 5 years, and you needed these huge down payments, like 50%, which basically meant only people who were already wealthy could afford to buy a home.
Yeah, the FHA changed everything. They started insuring loans that brought down payments way down, 20% or even less. They extended the loan periods to 20, even 30 years, made them self-amortizing. I mean, this innovation was the engine that built the modern American middle class. But, and this is the crucial point Kaplan and Dahl stress, this new middle class was overwhelmingly white. Why? Because the FHA adopted these risk criteria, often borrowing from the earlier Homeowners Loan Corporation, that essentially baked racial bias directly into how properties were valued.
This is the practice we now call redlining. It was pretty blatant. Neighborhoods got rated based on how stable the FHA thought the investment was. White, non-immigrant areas, they got the top ratings, A or green, that guaranteed access to cheap, federally backed money. But predominantly Black neighborhoods, or sometimes even just racially mixed neighborhoods, they had the lowest ratings, D or red. The assessment was literally that the presence of Black residents inherently lowered property values and destabilized the investment. They were deemed uninsurable.
And the FHA's own underwriting manual wasn't exactly subtle about the goal here. It explicitly promoted segregation. It stated, and this is incredible, if a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that properties shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes, end quote. The FHA actively recommended using racial covenants, those legal clauses in deeds, to bar non-white groups from owning property. This preference, plus favoring new suburban housing over mixed urban centers, essentially locked Black Americans out of the primary federal way of generating wealth over generations. The government literally engineered a segregated housing market, guaranteeing that property in Black communities would be worth less than similar property in white communities.
And this structural exclusion, it got reinforced even by policies that looked race-neutral on the surface. Take the GI Bill, right? Passed in 1944. Offered amazing benefit subsidized credit, home loans to millions of returning vets from WWII, Black and white alike, at least on paper.
But the devil, as they say, was in the implementation. The federal money got funneled through local boards, which were overwhelmingly controlled by white officials. And these local criteria often deliberately excluded existing urban homes, which is where most Black veterans lived. Instead, they heavily favored these brand new, segregated suburban developments. The result, as documented by folks like Ira Katznelson, was that the vast majority of Black veterans were just systematically shut out of that huge post-war homeownership boom. The boom that lifted millions of white families into prosperity and gave them equity while their black comrades, who fought the same war, were pushed back into devalued urban housing or worse, exploitative rental markets.
Right. And this deliberate exclusion from the legitimate, subsidized housing market, it created this massive vacuum. If you couldn't get a SAVE FHA-backed loan, where could you possibly turn if you needed a place to live for your family? And that vacuum, well, it was filled by rampant private predation, a kind of quiet plunder that Ta-Nehisi Coates details so vividly. Since FHA and VA-backed mortgages just weren't an option, black families desperate for a home were often forced into something called contract selling.
Let's slow down here for a sec, because the story of Clyde Ross in North Lawndale, Chicago, it's just essential for understanding the human cost of this. Clyde Ross and his family, they were looking for a home back in the 50s, but they were completely shut out of the FHA market, no legitimate loans. So he ends up buying his house from a speculator. And get this, the speculator had bought that same house just 6 months earlier for $12,000. Ross was forced to pay $27,500.
That markup alone is just predatory. But the mechanics of the contract itself are even worse. Under a contract sale, the buyer, like Ross, had all the responsibilities of an owner. They had to pay for maintenance, taxes, insurance. But they got none of the benefits. They were essentially glorified renters, but liable for the property's upkeep. And crucially, they built zero equity. Zero. If they missed even a single payment, maybe they lost their job, got sick, they immediately forfeited their down payment, all the monthly payments they'd already made, and the property itself. Then the speculator could just turn around, resell it on contract to another desperate family, and repeat the whole cycle. Coates calls the system legal theft. He documents how these contract sellers got incredibly rich. One seller's estate was estimated at like $3 million just from this racket.
And this wasn't just, a few bad apples. It was a direct consequence of government policy creating a market failure that basically invited this kind of exploitation. The Contract Buyers League, or CBL, which Ross eventually joined, they fought back. They actually sued, demanding restitution. They argued it was a deprivation of their rights under the 13th and 14th Amendments. They were basically charging society with this decades-long crime against their community that led directly to their economic ruin.
Yeah, and despite the mounting evidence, the pressure from the civil rights movement, those early federal attempts to outlaw housing discrimination faced just immense political resistance, really entrenched. President Kennedy's 1962 Executive Order 11-63, which was supposed to prevent discrimination in federal housing programs, well, it was largely seen as symbolic. Federal agencies kind of slow-walked implementation, resisted it, and often state laws just overrode it anyway.
The political pushback was so intense that when Congress passed the landmark Civil Rights Act in 1964, and then the Voting Rights Act in 1965, they explicitly excluded housing from coverage. Just think about that. Congress legislated the right to vote, the right to use public restrooms, but housing, the absolute central engine of wealth building for most Americans, was deemed too sensitive, too controversial to touch.
So when the Fair Housing Act, that's Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act, finally did pass in 1968, it was heavily diluted, watered down from the start. The enforcement mechanisms were notoriously weak. HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, couldn't actually pursue cases itself. It could only investigate and try to get people to agree, conciliate. Private lawsuits were really hard, expensive, and the damages were capped at just $1,000. I mean, that's hardly a deterrent. And the Department of Justice, they rarely pursued the big systemic pattern or practice cases that you'd need to really combat organized discrimination across the board.
So that means, essentially, for 2 whole decades after anti-discrimination laws were officially on the books, widespread discriminatory practices just kept going. Things like racial searing by real estate agents, banks denying loans in whole neighborhoods, it continued more or less unchecked.
And this is exactly why Kaplan and Valls conclude that these anti-discrimination policies were, well, simply too little, too late. Even the stronger 1988 Fair Housing Amendments Act, which did increase penalties and shifted more enforcement burden to HUD and DOJ, even that struggled to undo the accumulated damage, the compounding damage. By 1988, you had decades of government-sponsored segregation, the wealth disparities that came with it. It was also deeply entrenched. Just passing laws against discrimination couldn't, by itself, undo the structural inequality that earlier government actions and private exploitation had created. The problem wasn't just individual bias anymore. It was the total denial of access to capital. And the lack of that capital then just perpetuated itself generation after generation.
And these disadvantages, they absolutely persist. It shows how this wealth gap becomes self-perpetuating. Studies still show that African Americans are significantly less likely to be encouraged to apply for rentals or mortgages compared to white counterparts, even when you control for income and other demographics. And this isn't just about a lost opportunity down the road, it's an immediate financial drain right now.
Exactly. John Yinger actually quantified this ongoing financial burden. He estimated that just the process of searching for housing costs Black Americans, on average, about $4,000 more than white Americans looking for similar housing. He calls it the discrimination tax. You pay this extra cost every single time you move. It comes from lost time, fewer options presented, maybe higher interest rates offered, just differential treatment overall. It ensures that the wealth gap created decades ago continues to compound and actually grow today. The operations of the market, just left alone, are not going to erode this kind of structural inequality.
Okay, now we're going to shift gears pretty significantly. We're moving from the quantifiable damage of 20th century housing policy to the even broader foundational question of the original debt, the debt incurred by forced labor during slavery itself. This is where Thomas Kramer's work comes in. He focuses on quantifying the value of that forced slave labor. And he notes, interestingly, that the time lapse, about 150 years since abolition in 1865, is actually comparable to several historical precedents for multi-generational compensation.
Yeah, this point is really crucial for pushing back against the "it's too complicated" or "it was too long ago" arguments. He's establishing administrative feasibility. Kramer provides two very detailed historical precedents. The first one, the French spoliation claims from around 1793 to 1800, serves as a kind of moral and legal example.
Right, those were compensation payments the U.S. government made over 123 years to the descendants of American ship owners. This was for claims the U.S. had basically released France from as part of a treaty. The argument for payment was rooted right in the Fifth Amendment. Private property taken for public use requires just compensation. Senator Charles Sumner even argued back in 1864 that these claims were like heirlooms passed down through generations. So it shows Congress was willing and able to recognize property-related financial debts owed to descendants over more than a century.
Exactly. And the second precedent is, well, much darker, but it's equally instructive about administrative feasibility. The Haiti independence debt from 1825 all the way to 1947. After the Haitian Revolution, the former slaves were actually forced by France under threat of invasion to pay an indemnity, a huge sum, 150 million francs, to their former French owners and their heirs. This payment plan stretched over 156 years. Now, obviously, this is a deeply immoral example rewarding the perpetrators. But, Kramer argues, it dramatically proves the political and administrative possibility of tracing claims and heirs over vast stretches of time and across many generations.
And Kramer really emphasizes the level of administrative detail involved there. The French government produced this enormous, meticulous document, the État détaillé of 1828. It listed all the former property owners and meticulously traced their heirs, sometimes listing like 40 different names for just a single claim. So Kramer's point is, if 19th century colonial bureaucracy could trace debt inheritance over 150 years to reward the victimizers, well, modern governments certainly have the capability to trace claims to compensate the victims' descendants today.
Right. So having established that feasibility, Kramer then launches into a critique of earlier economic estimates of reparations from the 1990s. These estimates range wildly, from maybe $36 billion up to nearly $10 trillion in 2009 dollars. And these earlier estimates were generally based on slave prices, the market price, which reflected the expected future income the owner could get from cash crops like cotton or tobacco.
Wait, hang on. Why is basing the calculation on slave prices not good enough? Isn't the market price the most sort of accurate reflection of an asset's value at the time?
Well, that's where the economic nuance comes in, and it's a really important critique. Kramer argues that relying only on slave prices focuses solely on the value generated by cash crops sold in formal markets. It ignores two absolutely critical components. First, the value of all the forced subsistence labor. The food slaves grew, the goods they made, the services they provided just for their own upkeep, for the master's family running the household. None of that stuff entered the GDP or a market price calculation. And second, perhaps more fundamentally, relying on slave prices adopts the perspective of the slave owner. The calculation centers on the owner's lost profit, not the slave's lost life and labor.
Right. The slave's perspective is what should matter here. They weren't just denied profits. They were denied their time, their freedom, and any kind of fair wage for their total contribution.
Precisely. So Kramer proposes this alternative calculation. It's based on the victim's perspective. You multiply the estimated number of unremunerated work hours by the historical hourly wage for free labor during that same period, roughly 1776 to 1865. It's an attempt to estimate the money slave owners would have had to spend if they'd hired free laborers to do all the work slaves performed, including all that domestic consumption and subsistence stuff.
Okay, now we get to the part that really determines the final number, the interest rate. When you calculate the present value of a debt from that long ago, you have to choose a rate for how the value compounds over, 150 years. Kramer uses what he calls a conservative 3% interest rate, compounded over that period, 1776 to 1865.
And this choice of interest rate is absolutely crucial. It leads to two main scenarios. Scenario one, which is more conservative and only counts slaves of working age during daylight hours, yields a debt estimate of 5.9 trillion in 2009 dollars. Scenario two is more liberal. It counts all slaves, all ages, 24 hours a day. The argument here is that even a child's care was forced preparation for labor, and that all time, even sleep, was dictated by the forced system. That scenario yields a truly staggering $14.2 trillion.
Whoa. That $14.2 trillion figure is, well, it's shocking. But let me push back a bit. Isn't choosing 3% still kind of subjective? Couldn't that be attacked politically? I mean, if you used a more standard commercial market rate, maybe 5% or 7%, wouldn't the number become astronomically, impossibly huge?
That's an excellent point, and Kramer actually addresses this. He intentionally uses 3% as a conservative lower bound. He acknowledges that using standard market interest rates, which often reflect the historical rate of return on capital, maybe 6% or 7%, would indeed result in figures many, many times higher than even the $14.2 trillion. By using 3%, he makes the figure perhaps more politically digestible, while still demonstrating the sheer magnitude of the debt. The argument is, even by the most conservative, reasonable measure, the debt is immense.
Right, and just to give you some perspective on that scale, Kramer points out that the entire U.S. GDP in 2009 was about $14.25 trillion. So scenario two, representing the value of unpaid slave labor at that conservative 3% rate, basically rivals the entire economic output of the U.S. in that year. He argues this massive size highlights the enormous contribution slave labor made in essentially kickstarting the U.S. economy. And it also shows how typical GDP measurements often just render unpaid forced labor invisible in our standard historical accounts.
And if we connect this back to public policy today, even that more conservative scenario one estimate, the $5.9 trillion, that absolutely dwarfs the combined stimulus packages passed under Bush and Obama back in 2008, 2009, which totaled around $1.6 trillion. Those stimulus packages were huge government spending, politically unpopular with many, but ultimately deemed feasible and necessary for future growth. Kramer suggests that while stimulus packages inject capital for future growth, reparations would be the repayment of the startup capital that slaves essentially provided to the U.S. economy. It's a delayed repayment that wouldn't just correct a historic wrong, but could also provide a significant economic stimulus today.
Okay, so given that enormous scale quantified by Kramer, and thinking back to Kaplan and Valls and the difficulty of piercing that epistemological fog at the individual level, figuring out exactly how much each specific person today has been harmed by 150 years of compounding injustice. Kaplan and Valls suggest that maybe reparations are best delivered, at least partly, through structural policies designed specifically to close that aggregate wealth gap. They kind of advocate moving away from the idea of just cutting individual checks and towards more structural remedies.
Right. And since they established that 20th century housing policy was such a primary mechanism for locking Black Americans out of generational wealth, it makes sense that the remedies should target that area specifically. They lay out several policy suggestions, all focused on creating wealth, particularly through home equity.
What kind of suggestions? Well, things like dedicating way more resources to preventing and prosecuting housing discrimination stuff like racial steering or predatory lending. And more concretely, they propose offering highly favorable mortgage terms like low or even no down payments, low interest rates specifically targeted towards African Americans. And beyond just housing, they talk about creating wealth opportunities through subsidized business loans, targeted grants, dedicated programs for education access.
Now, this raises that important and sometimes tricky policy question about race-conscious versus race-blind solutions. While some of their proposals are explicitly race-conscious, like the targeted mortgages, they also bring up the interesting idea of potentially using race-blind policies, but policies that are explicitly designed to target racial inequality.
Why complicate it with race-blind language, though? If the harm itself was so clearly race-based, shouldn't the fix be race-based too?
Well, part of it is certainly about political palatability. Race-blind policies often have an easier time surviving constitutional challenges. But, as Glenn Larry suggests, the deeper goal is ensuring the policies are not racially indifferent, even if they appear racially neutral on the surface. There's this profound, almost tragic irony, isn't there? Using race-blind policies today to try and correct racist policies from the past, like the GI Bill or FHA guidelines, which were often written in race-blind language themselves. but were absolutely not race indifferent in how they were applied. The goal is to correct the structure of that dual housing market that the government itself intentionally created.
Okay, now let's bring in Coates. Ta-Nehisi Coates kind of strips away some of the quantification and the policy details to focus intensely on the moral debt. He argues that the debt is fundamentally moral, it's collective, and it requires a national reckoning, not just, a financial transaction. He famously compares the American situation to West Germany's post-war reparations to Israel after the Holocaust.
Yeah, that German example is really powerful because apparently the German populace at the time felt very little collective guilt. Maybe only 5% felt personally guilty about the atrocities. Yet Chancellor Konrad Adenauer pursued that reparations agreement aggressively. Why? Because he saw it as necessary for Germany's spiritual renewal, for its standing in the world moving forward. Coates argues that the question for America isn't really whether we can pay the kind of massive debt Kramer calculated, but whether we are even willing to seriously study the debt and its profound ongoing consequences.
And this is exactly where the political resistance becomes so visible. Coates points repeatedly to Congressman John Conyers Jr.'s bill, H.R. 40. That bill simply calls for a commission to study slavery, study its ongoing effects, and propose potential remedies. That bill has been introduced for more than 30 years now, and it has never once made it to the House floor for an actual vote.
The persistent failure of H.R. 40 to even get a vote suggests that the resistance really is existential, as Coates puts it. Politically, the objections usually center on a few key things. Who pays? Why should taxpayers today bear the burden for things done by generations long past? How can we possibly determine modern liability for something so old and systemic? These objections really highlight, maybe, an unwillingness across the nation to truly confront the fact that so much of its founding wealth was built on the kind of plunder documented by both Kramer and Coates.
Right. Coates argues forcefully that the crime of this plunder isn't just the work of a few bad actors or loud demagogues. It's a systemic failure that implicates the American people, past and present. We can't, he argues, proudly claim the intellectual genius of Thomas Jefferson while simultaneously ignoring his taking of Sally Hemings's body. We can't celebrate George Washington crossing the Delaware while ignoring his relentless pursuit of his runaway slave, Owenny Judge. The current wealth gap in this view is simply the physical, compounding manifestation of this centuries-old, unpaid debt.
And Coates concludes with this really provocative idea that white supremacy isn't just about prejudice. It's a force so fundamental to America, woven into its very financial structure through things like the FHA, that truly wrestling with reparations requires us to imagine a new country. A country that's willing to acknowledge that the system, as it currently stands, is built upon a foundation of unremunerated, essentially stolen labor and capital.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up.
Yeah, what's really fascinating here, especially for you as a policy student, is seeing how these different arguments kind of weave together. You have Kaplan and Valls providing the moral and philosophical case for shifting focus from the distant past of slavery to the quantifiable recent damage of 20th century housing policy. Then Kramer comes in and frames the absolutely massive scale of the original debt in these hard, even conservative economic terms, showing how the U.S. economy's foundation rests on trillions in unpaid labor. And finally, Coates provides that powerful narrative and moral urgency, connecting the quiet plunder of contract selling in Chicago right back to the forced destruction of families during slavery.
Right, these aren't just, footnotes in a history book. The argument is that they are active, present drivers of structural inequality. Inequality that, as Kaplan and Valls conclude, requires an equally active structural policy response because the market alone won't fix it. The core challenge for public policy here seems crystal clear. The existing structure of the market appears almost designed to perpetually recreate the wealth cap that was initially created by explicitly racist policies like redlining and FHA exclusion.
So what does all this mean for you, the student grappling with public policy? We've explored how post-WWII government policies created this incredibly powerful engine for economic benefit home equity for one group while systematically shutting out another. And that led directly to this massive self-perpetuating intergenerational wealth gap we still see today.
So, if we accept the premise that the operations of the market alone will not erode racial inequality, here's a final thought to chew on. What specific, immediate local housing policy, something short of full national reparations, maybe a municipal loan guarantee fund, or perhaps a hyper-targeted property tax rebate for homeowners in historically redlined neighborhoods? What local policy could best address the self-perpetuating nature of this intergenerational wealth gap described in these readings? Something to definitely mull over as you conclude this section of your reading.